Hey there everyone, this is Samuel Johnson and welcome back to the Steven Universe Retrospectives. And today we're going to be discussing episodes 105 and 106 of Steven Universe, Buddy's Book, and Mindful Education. And one of these is kind of filler, one of these is somewhat character driven. I'll get to which when I get to the plot summaries, and of course we'll start with the odd numbered episode first, which in this case is Buddy's Book. And what's going on in this episode is that Steven and Connie are going to the library, the Budwick Public Library, I think it's called. And the reason why they're going there is because, well, Connie wants to get a head start in the 7th grade, and, well, she doesn't trust the internet to gather information. As apparently the last time she did that, she wound up doing a report on raccoons that have heat vision. I wish that were kind of true, but anyway, we're not talking about that. And as such, since Steven loves books, Connie felt that it'd be cool to bring him along so he could just like browse around. And of course, once Steven sees the library, he's just overjoyed and excited, wants to explore everything, even though it constantly gets him shushed because he gets loud. However, as he searches through the various shelves, he ends up finding one particular book that gets his attention: a journal that will apparently belong to Buddy Budwick, the first mate from Captain Dewey's Voyage, you know, the guy who founded Beach City. And within the book, there are various drawings and sketches detailing various gem locations or artifacts and so on and so forth. And when Steven sees this, well, he's just excited and immediately goes to show it to Connie, who the instant she realizes it's gem-related, ends up just pushing all of her homework aside so that she and Steven can read it. From there, the episode is kind of sort of mostly a flashback story with little bits interspersed of the present day as Connie and Steven are reading the journal. And so from there, the story is just mostly Buddy's story, though since the story is told from Steven and Connie's own mind's eye, the characters within it are people they relate to, and since Jamie played Buddy in the play that Steven was in, well, he's playing Buddy in their imaginations. So, basically, in the journal, it details the story of Buddy after Beach City was founded. Basically, while he was happy that his captain was immortalized in a bronze statue and now has a city to his name, well, Buddy felt that he would be, well, essentially brushed aside. He was just the first mate after all, and ultimately he felt he would end up just being a bit player in someone else's story, and that his name would just eventually be forgotten. As such, to try and make something of his life, he decided that he was going to be an explorer and discover the things that no man has ever laid eyes upon. And so, basically, he began exploring the world. One of the first places that he visited being the strawberry fields, the one that used to be the gem battlefield. And, of course, when he arrived, he was in awe of everything, and as you saw in the journal, he began sketching it out. But as he was doing his work, he wound up running into a couple of the crystal gems, specifically Pearl and Garnet, who claim they're there to save Buddy. Of course, Buddy says that he doesn't really need saving. He's just exploring, and nothing's really hurting, and nothing's really coming after him. As such, he says that he plans to just see the whole world, even having a map on standby. However, Pearl, who is consistently paranoid and neurotic, tells him that there are some places onto this planet that he should never go, and she'll detail those places on his map so that he'll know to just steer clear of them. And Garnet even tells Dewey that only the bravest, most courageous, most memorable explorers would dare go to those places. On side note, I love how Garnet just pretty much urges Buddy on without really saying go to those places. It's a nice way of just kind of getting it over Pearl's head. But either way, yeah, Garnet and Pearl leave, satisfied with their journey, and Buddy believing that he wants to see these things, decides to follow the unintentional itinerary that Pearl left for him, and he begins exploring all these various places across the planet that are essentially just leftovers from when the gems took up residence, including the Sea Spire, the upside down pyramid, you know, the one that had a gem at its center, I'm trying to remember, the sky, not the sky arena, but the place where they found the heaven and earth beetles, just pretty much any location that the gems have gone to, he has been there and he's cataloged it, including which also includes the communication hub when it was still in its prime. However, which this also brings up something that's important, in the present day, as Steven and Connie are kind of keeping up with all the sketches that he does of all these various gem locations and artifacts, there's one in the book that Steven does not recognize. It looks like a small palace, so to speak. Basically, with looks like ivory ivory coverings and a cloth or a cloth just for a door. And the description for it calls it a palanquin. Now, while Steven has not seen this before, This is something that we have seen. This Palanquin is actually something that we have seen previously in the show. Specifically, the final episode of season 2, which I think was the answer, wherein Garnet told Steven how Ruby and Sapphire met, and in that episode we actually did see the Palanquin. It was piloted by Blue Diamond. So, yeah, I'm only mentioning this because it's going to become important later. But point is, as Jamie continues exploring, eventually his travels lead him to the Prime Kindergarten. And while he is in awe of this mysterious place, especially with all the holes where all the gems popped out of and all the injectors scattered around, a thought does cross his mind. Because it's clear that with all this machinery here, someone's been here before. And it starts to make him question his worth as an adventurer and an explorer. And as he's pondering this, that's when the third crystal gem appears, Amethyst, who it turns out is back at the Prime Kindergarten to just pretty much just check on the neighbors, so to speak, which, again, kind of makes sense since she used to live there, and she wants to know what the heck Buddy is doing there. As such, Buddy explains how he's been traveling around and seeing all these exotic places and cataloging them, but Amethyst kind of points out a flaw in his whole adventuring plan. He ain't discovering shit. Basically, every place he's gone to is a place that's just pointed out to him. He's not found a single thing that was not already discovered first, and the instant that Buddy realizes this, well, he just kind of he just starts breaking down as he realizes his suspicions were right. He's not a real explorer. He's not discovering anything new, and he's just a failure and hasn't discovered anything. But Amethyst decides to kind of give him an olive branch, as she explains that there is one thing that he could probably discover that nobody else has seen. The Sandcastle Pyramid, where the desert glass was. Basically, and because of how the desert glass operated, the sandcastle just pretty much moves all over the place. And while Amethyst can give him a general location, she cannot tell him exactly where it is, and that if he finds it, he might be the first person to ever see it. As such, this gives Buddy some newfound determination, and he decides to go out and find the sandcastle. Unfortunately, finding said sandcastle is easier said than done, as when he arrives at the desert where it's supposed to be, he can't find it, and he just spends like 10 days wandering around, and eventually heat stroke starts getting the best of him, and he ends up passing out in the desert. However, that's when the fourth crystal gem ends up meeting him, and it's here he comes face to face with Rose Quartz, who it turns out is hanging out with a pack of lions. I'll let that sink in. And as such, when Buddy gets woken up, he explains to Rose what he's been doing and how he's been looking for the sandcastle because he wants to discover something that nobody else has. However, as when Rose hears about that, it's like, oh, the sandcastle? You mean like that one over there? And sure enough, she points right to the sandcastle. And at first, Buddy's overjoyed that he's found it, until he realizes Rose found it first. At which point he continues damning himself again, and once more laments to Rose that he's discovered all these amazing things, but he's not the first person to discover them. However, Rose does point something out to him. That these things have all been discovered before, but they've never been recorded so elegantly and in such a way for people to essentially enjoy, which does lead to a very funny thing where she kind of sort of breaks the fourth wall and looks to the camera, which results in Buddy just looking between the audience and her, like, just thinking, what the hell is she looking at? But either way, Rose tells Buddy that, he may not be an explorer, but he's a damn good writer. And she does tell him, have you ever considered being an author? And sure enough, that's what Buddy does. And sure enough, he ends up writing a lot of books. So many books, to the point where so much so that he ends up running out of room and realizes he could fill a whole library with these things. And sure enough, that's what leads to the present day as the Buddy Budwick Library is where Stephen and Connie are. Yep, he's the one that founded it, and this is how he wound up leaving his mark, by becoming an author and opening this place. Though when Stephen and Connie realize that he founded the place, they end up seeing a portrait of him, and he looks nothing like Jamie. But at the very least, they do find the story inspiring, and glad they read it, and thus the episode ends with them imagining Buddy as Jamie again, and he giving them a little wink. So it's nice. I like it. But as for mindful education, this is the episode that, as I talked about 2 weeks ago, kind of hits me in an emotional spot. I'll explain why when I get to my thoughts in the episode, but put simply, my relationship with this episode is complicated. So basically, what's going on in this episode is that it's another Stephen and Connie episode, But what's going on is that they're not going out to do something social. Connie's coming over to Stevens for more training, and specifically this day they're going to be experimenting with fusion training, and basically Stevani is going to be going in for combat training, and they're going to showcase what they've learned as a team and as a fusion. However, when Connie arrives for said training, her mind is a bit not she's not all there. It's clear she's thinking of something, and while Steven tries greeting her by wearing a bald cap and trying to make her wonder what the heck and trying to get a reaction, she's not paying attention to the point where when Steven finally explains that he's wearing said bald cap, well, the joke's kind of flown over her head. But either way, she does still come to training, and because this is a fusion training, Garnet wants to sit in, and of course she's all for cheering Steven, Connie, and Stevani on. So she even made a sign for it, with one side saying "Go Steven and Connie" and the other side saying "Go Stevani." As such, the quartet end up going back to the Sky Arena, and so Pearl ends up summoning up a couple of Hollow Pearls, and Steven and Connie end up fusing into Stevani, with the Hollow Pearls forming a much bigger Hollow Pearl. And sure enough, Stevani is able to actually hold their own, as they're actually able to go toe to toe with the giant Hollow Pearl, and even utilize some of Steven's abilities to help them in combat, as it turns out Stevani can actually utilize Steven's floating ability, though they have to kick their legs in order to make it work, so that's a thing, I guess. It's weird. Hold on one second. Sorry, my Alexa was listening in. Anyway, as I was saying, either way, basically, Stevani at first, when they realize that they have the floating powers, they think, this combat's in the bag, and they're about to go in for a killing blow, when suddenly, from their perspective, the Hollow Pearl changes into that of a kid. And at first, Stevani's a little confused until they suddenly shout out, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Mostly, "I'm sorry," before they end up missing the Hollow Pearl and end up unfused back into Steven and Connie, with Steven confused as to what the hell's going on, but Connie is in tears and ends up running away. As such, Steven ends up following after Connie, and Connie reveals why she's been why she's been so distant today. It turns out that she kind of had an incident earlier. While she was at school, she wanted, well, as she puts it, she beat up a kid. What had happened was that they were passing each other in the hallway, and she wound up bumping into her, and upon having this confrontation, Connie's battle instincts kicked in, and she wound up grabbing the kid and flipped him onto his back, which the instant the adrenaline wore off and Connie realized what she did, she was so broken up about it that she ran away, and it's just been on her mind ever since. While Steven understands the guilt from this, and even says Connie that sometimes you just gotta kind of keep it inside. But Garnet, well, she went to go check on the kids after they stormed out, and she says that she wants to help them. As such, she takes Connie and Steven away, and they end up going to the beach. And Garnet reveals a little interesting tidbit about fusion. We all know, as we've seen with fusion, it has to be a collaborative effort between the gems that make it up. And as Garnet reveals, if the gems are not in sync or there's no harmony in the fusion, it can cause disharmony in the fusion itself, or in the actual fusion that's created. So say for example, if let's say if Pearl and Amethyst formed Opal, and one of them had something going on their mind. Basically, that thing would end up sticking with Opal, and it will end up causing disharmony in Opal's own point of view, resulting in her kind of losing touch with reality. And the thing is, we have seen this before in the show, not with Opal, but we have seen it with Stevani. So, going back to a couple of Stevani's previous appearances, in their first appearance in Alone Together, what happened when... Remember when Stevani was at the dance and suddenly they began hallucinating that everyone was towering over them and that they were alone in a crystal ball? Yeah, it turns out that was an example of the disharmony in the fusion, as at that point, Connie's own stage fright and social anxieties wound up coming out and affected Stevani, which resulted in them hallucinating about the whole thing in the dance party. And again, we even saw it again in Beach City Drift when Stevani was obsessed with taking down Kevin. That innate desire to beat Kevin at his own game wound up affecting Stevani, And as a result, it caused disharmony in the fusion, which is what resulted in Stevani hallucinating. And that, in which in that episode's case was when they saw the road begin to disappear and Kevin's head almost attacked them, which is what basically which. Yeah, I like that we actually get a bit of an explanation for that, and it gives us a better idea of how fusion typically operates, because in a way that makes sense. Since a fusion is supposed to be a mix of two different beings, there does need to be harmony. And while fusion is typically ultimately its own personality, the individual parts that make it up are two different people. And as we've seen, unless the beings that make up a fusion need to be able to collaborate, because if they don't collaborate, it can lead to them falling apart. But what we see here is that sometimes the mental state of one of the beings that make up a fusion can have a greater impact on the fusion itself, which again, it makes sense. When you take two separate personalities and then just mush them together to create something entirely new, it's a mix. Basically, what it becomes is a mix and match of all the different parts of the personalities of the two individual beings. And so, if some of those parts are dealing with trauma, it can cause kind of a ripple effect. To kind of give an example, I remember in Crisis on Infinite Earths, it's just to kind of give an example from the story. In that book, one of the characters, I forgot her name. Hold on one second. Sorry, I had to look up the name. But yeah, in Crisis on Infinite Earths, one of the characters in the story, named Harbinger, was split into several, into individual parts. Each of them meant to go out to different realities and recruit different superheroes. However, one of the Harbingers wound up getting possessed by a shadow demon, and while she still did her job, when all the various Harbingers wound up fusing back together into the single whole, the one Harbinger who was possessed began kind of acting like an infection, like a cancer in her body that began slowly corrupting her. And in a similar way, it's kind of the same way with fusion when dealing with the trauma. When one half of the fusion is dealing with these issues, it's mixed in with the greater whole. And as a result, even if the fusion itself is not thinking of whatever caused the trauma in the first place, it does find ways to manifest. And as a result, it creates disharmony because, well, this is a trauma that's specific to the parts, and as a result, it can cause them to quite literally fall apart. And it can take these small issues that individually are troubling the person and turn them into something big, as from the mind's eye of the fusion, they become very real. They become very big, and they end up hurting. And we kind of see, which, yeah, like I said, we've seen that before with Stevani in other episodes. So I do kind of like that they showcase it more here, that they actually do explain how it operates, because it gives more detail on the fusion and adds further the readings to the whole. Both sides need to be in harmony for the thing to work, because if something isn't right, it can have a greater effect on the fusion. As such, Garnet wants to give Steven and Connie some pointers, and so though she tells them that she'll need Stevani for this. So Steven and Connie wants more fuse back into Stevani, and from there we get, well, kind of the point in the episode that begins affecting me. It's as Garnet ends up going into a meditation stance and wants Stevani to follow her example, and they begin, well, meditating. And from this meditation, we end up getting a song, and it's actually a really sweet song. Here Comes a Thought. And the basic point of the song is it's talking about how individual things that we're dealing with, things that we do can have an impact on us. Big or small, they can fester, and they can have an effect, and they can affect who we are as they continue to linger in our mind and we continue to focus in on them. Now, and the thing is, with those problems, the more we try to pretend they're not there, the more apparent they become. The more we try to deny it, the more it begins to fester, the more it begins to grow. And at its core, we need to acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge it and deal with the problem. Ultimately remember, it's just a thought. Because after all, there are people there who are there to help you deal with this trauma, and ultimately we have to confront. And ultimately, even if it feels scary to confront these issues, to confront this whatever's causing problems, it needs to be confronted, because ultimately, if you don't confront it, it's just going to get worse. And that's mostly kind of what the episode is, that these issues can pile up and they can cause strife, they can cause problems, and they can feel like they matter so much the more you think about it. But at the end of the day, you have to find a way to calm yourself, take a moment to, as the song says, find yourself and ask yourself, is this really how I fall apart? Or how we fall apart? And ultimately, you're not alone. There's always people there who want to help you. They're going to be there for you, and they will always provide support. And we see that through the song, as while Garnet and Stevonnie are meditating, we do get this little mindscape view, as we see the individual beings that make up both of their fusions just dealing with their problems. In the case of Garnet, we see Ruby and Sapphire, and the problems are represented by these weird glowing butterflies, and for Garnet, we see Ruby and Sapphire as they're dealing with theirs, whereas Ruby sees one individual butterfly that's supposed to represent her problems, and she just pursues it angrily and tries yelling at it to go away, get lost, and it's having an effect on her, while Sapphire ends up getting swarmed by what looks like a storm of them. Which is, again, which, I admit, this part is actually something I learned from, like, either YouTube or Tumblr, but basically, it's supposed to be representative of how they both deal with their issues, as Ruby is a very hot-headed and temperamental, and whenever she encounters a problem, she tends to she just ends up hyper-focusing on it until she can get it to go away. Whereas with Sapphire, because of her future vision, she sees infinite possibilities for how things can hurt you, and it can lead to her becoming worried about all the things that can go wrong. But ultimately, it's only together that they both can overcome this and confront these issues. And likewise with Stevonnie, they end up seeing Steven and Connie walking by, and we see Connie end up having to, as she remembers when she attacked the kid, and ultimately how Steven is there to help her and how they can deal with this together. It's nice. It's very heartfelt, and when I first saw the episode, it just kind of got to me. And it turns out the advice really worked well for Connie, because the next day, Connie comes back for training, and she's doing a lot better. As it turns out, she went to go talk to the kid that she essentially judo flipped, who turns out his name is Josh, and she apologized. He said he understood, and he actually wanted to get some pointers on moves. So, everything's good, right? Connie's all happy. They can get back to fusion training, right? Well, as Connie enters Steven's house and puts her stuff down and runs off to go get changed, Steven ends up looking to her bag, and he sees a glowing butterfly resting on his mother's blade. Well, we soon see that pay off, as we then cut back to the Sky Arena, as once more Stevonnie is practicing, and again, Garnet's just sitting back and watching. And this time around, it looks like Stevonnie's actually in better sync, actually kicking ass, taking out Hollow Pearls one by one. They're doing so well for themselves, and ultimately it's just down to them and one other Pearl. And so Stevonnie gets their sword ready, goes in for the kill, stabs the Hollow Pearl, and it begins happening, and suddenly the hallucinations begin again. Only it's not Connie that's causing them this time. It's Steven. Because from Stevonnie's point of view, they just stabbed Bismuth. And immediately we start to see a shift in Stevonnie's demeanor, as immediately we start seeing a split. As we see Steven and Connie inside them just kind of dealing with the trauma, and inside Stevonnie, Steven is just freaking out, as when he sees Bismuth, he's apologizing that he's just apologizing to hell and back, and as he talks about Bismuth and what happened with it and what happened with her, suddenly he begins hallucinating. Suddenly Stevonnie begins hallucinating even more, and behind them they see this giant visage of Jasper as she was being corrupted. And again, within Stevonnie, Steven is just pleading and going, I'm sorry, I tried to help you, but you wouldn't let me help you." And then as Jasper looms over them, she ends up shifting again, this time into Eyeball Ruby, with Steven once again just going, I'm sorry, I told you to stop, but you wouldn't listen." And basically, as this trio of Steven's trauma surrounds Stevonnie, inside, Connie is still trying to assure Steven, it's okay, I'm here, they're just thoughts, it's okay. But things continue to get worse, as suddenly the hallucinations manifest into one final big one. The face of Rose Quartz, who looks down at Stevonnie with complete and utter disdain. And when Stevonnie sees this, they just start breaking down as they begin crying, and her only words are no as she begins backing away. And unfortunately, as they hallucinate, they end up losing their footing and fall off the sky arena before Garnet and Pearl can save them. As such, as they're falling to Earth, they end up unfusing back into Steven and Connie. And while Connie is freaking out, going, "Oh, we have to fuse again, we have to float," Steven is in a similar situation to Connie was, as it looks like he's breaking down, and he doesn't want to think about these things. He can't think about them. He can't confront them because the guilt is too strong. Because he wanted to help them. He wanted to help all of these gems. He wanted to help them all, but none of them would listen. None of them wanted his help. They all kept pushing him away, and he had no choice. And it's clear that guilt is just eating him alive, but Connie goes in and assures him that he has to confront them. He can't. If he pushes them away, it's just going to get worse. He has to think about it. But he's not alone. He has Connie. They can do this together. And as such, with that in mind, they do end up fusing back into Stevonnie, which does put them back in hallucination land. But thankfully, as Stevonnie starts restructuring themselves with restructuring themselves, they're able to deal with the thoughts, and the hallucinations stop. Stevonnie is able to swing their legs and float, and manages to float down to the surface. And by the time they land, they're fine. And the last thing we see in the episode is Stevonnie lying in the grass below the sky arena, looking up into the sky and telling themselves, "It's okay." So, yeah. Okay, so my thoughts on the episodes. First, Buddy's book. This one is a nice little distraction, and this one, at most, is a nice little distraction. It is clearly more there to kind of act as a filler episode, but it's an entertaining filler episode. There are a couple things in there that do pay off later, but as it is, it's just a nice little just a fun little period piece. As we see a character from the past just kind of exploring more of the world, and I do kind of like that. It's just essentially a bit more world building because, well, while we have seen a bit of all these places before in previous episodes of Steven Universe, it helps establish further that these are centralized things in this world. They already exist. That they're things that people are aware of, but just sort of accept, which is, again, something you kind of have to realize with the Steven universe. Well, it definitely looks a lot like our world and operates a lot like our world. It's not our world. There are distinct differences, and we can even see that in the maps, in the world's physiology, in the world's, well, structure and its geology. Yes, that's the right word. I don't know why I was saying physiology, but yeah, which another thing, a funny thing I like. I love how the United States of America is probably one of the few countries in the world, that was not geometrically altered. I mean, I think North America was kind of somewhat changed, but otherwise, United States is fine. I don't know why. It's weird. But either way, yeah. I do kind of like that we get to see that, and I do like that essentially humans didn't just cover their eyes and pretend nothing was there when it came to the gem stuff. They did pursue it. They did look into it. We still had Buddy as he was exploring the world and finding all these structures of the gems left behind from when they occupied Earth. See, which I think is cool. I like seeing that there is essentially like a little guide to it. It's just, again, it's very nice. And I like the kind of message at the end when Buddy essentially takes what he learns from his travels and kind of converts into something else. Like, at first he wanted to make a name for himself as just a mighty traveler who discovered all these grand and exquisite things. But ultimately, when he realized he wasn't the first person to discover them, it almost disheartened him. But thanks to Rose's proddings, it made him realize that there was another passion he could pursue. Being a writer, which, honestly, I kind of like little stories like that. That sometimes the path that we end up on is not the path that we initially traveled with. And as a result of that, I'm losing my train of thought. Like I said, the path that we end up on may not be the one that we traveled with, but ultimately it's one that's ultimately best for us, because it can lead to strange things the way our lives turn out, that certain choices that we make along the way can lead us to things that we never thought we would want, but when we get them, we're happy to have them. And you kind of see that with Buddy in the episode. He set out to make a name for himself by thinking he had to be an explorer, by discovering things that no man has ever seen before. But then likewise, when he realizes that, when Rose tells him that yeah, he's seen these things before, but they haven't ever been recorded so eloquently. He ends up finding his passion with that. He ends up finding his passion in writing, and becomes a writer. And he gets such a high passion for it that he ends up writing just book after book, to the point where he ends up literally filling a library. Which I like that. Essentially, it continues expanding on his whole what he was trying to get when he became an explorer, to find and discover new things, just showcase them to the world, and likewise combining his love of writing as what's a library but a place where you can gather knowledge, read about stories, explore new worlds, and gain new experiences. I like that. It's nice. And I feel like it's a natural conclusion. Overall, the plot doesn't really have any impact on any later episodes, aside from a couple things that I'll talk about in a sec. But for the plot itself, it's a nice little story. Just a nice little distraction that just kind of helps showcase more of the world, and gives a nice little gives some nice little stuff with Buddy, and still having some nice humor with his interaction with the crystal gems. Which I thought was nice. Still love Rose Quartz's kind of fourth wall break. It's nice. But when it comes down to stuff that pays off later, there are two things that I mentioned. First off is the palanquin. Again, like, you have to remember that Stephen had never seen a palanquin, so he had no idea that a palanquin was something that the Diamonds utilized. But when Stephen sees the palanquin in Buddy's book, well, he does start wondering about it, because everything else in the book he recognizes. So why doesn't he recognize this? Why doesn't he recognize the palanquin? Well, there's a reason, and we've kind of already been told about it. But I will wait till later to talk about it, because this particular palanquin, it's one unique to Stephen. But as for another bit of plot development, this one kind of is small, it's with Rose. As with Buddy, when he went around exploring in the desert, of course, like I mentioned, he encountered Rose, but as I also said, she was with a pack of lions. Now, remember where Stephen first found his lion? He originally found him in the desert, just kind of doing his own thing. And now here we see Rose traveling with a pack of lions herself, treating them as if they're family or friends. It just kind of makes you wonder, is there a connection between because we already know that lion belonged to Rose at some point. But the lions we see Rose traveling with here all look normal. None of them seem to have superpowers. They're just friendly to Rose and anyone she says are friends. So how are these lions connected to the one we know? It lays down the groundwork, doesn't it? Makes you think. Doesn't give any answers or any hints about what's going on. But it's clear that Rose's lion did definitely have something to do with this pack that she was traveling with. So it's a nice little hint. And where things go, well, you'll have to wait till next season to see that. But I like that the episode just lays the groundwork for both of those little plot points. So I dig it. It's nice, and overall, nice filler episode. As for mindful education, I should talk about this from what I consider an objective point of view. What I like about the episode is that it emphasizes, above all else, companionship in a way. Trauma and companionship. Everybody has something in their life that they regret. Something they think back on and cringe about. Something they think back on and they regret. Something that ultimately, whether it be something that just happened or something that happened years ago, it's something that still sits in their mind, and it's something that person was involved with, something that they weren't particularly proud of, and something that still sits with them. And ultimately, when it comes to our society, when it comes to all this, people tend to try and push that stuff away because it hurts to think about. Now we have to just move on, forget it ever happened, and just pretend, so to speak. But the thing is, shit like that festers. And the more we try to pretend it's not there, the worse it can get. And we see that and we kind of see that with Connie here. In the episode, we see that she is dealing with the trauma, or she's dealing with the negativity from guilt from having flipped Josh in the room, and basically throughout the whole episode, the more she tries to forget about it, the more prevalent it is in her mind, to the point where it's actually affecting her mood, her demeanor, her relationship. She finds it hard to focus on the lesson, and when she's Stevani, it causes hallucinations, which end up causing Stevani to go off their game. But made even worse is that we see how it also affects Steven. As discussed in previous vlogs, Steven, whether he's aware of it or not, is dealing with trauma in many regards. Having to deal with being in the shadow of his mother, feeling like he doesn't stack up in comparison to the crystal gems. And here we see another side of him. His guilt. Steven, as a character, wants to help others. He wants to, and even if they're an enemy, he will always try to offer a hand of friendship. Always try and give them a way out and say, this does not define you. You can be better. You can move on. You can learn. But the sad truth is that not everybody wants to be saved. Not everybody wants to take that hand of friendship. Many of them will fight back. Many of them will still see you as the enemy. And ultimately, when Steven was put in the position that when he dealt with said people, he had to ultimately make a choice, him or them. And while Steven definitely made the choice, and while Steven eventually had to choose himself, the guilt still just holds on like a vice in his mind. It's clear he still thinks about these people he couldn't save. Bismuth, who he had to poof in order to survive. Jasper, who literally knocked him aside when he tried to heal her. Or Eyeball Ruby, when he chucked her into space when she tried to kill him. These are all people he did not want to make an enemy of, or Jasper in the case she was already an enemy. But in each of these people, he wanted to offer help. He wanted to despite them being on opposite sides, he wanted to help them and heal them, to make them better so they wouldn't have to be these monsters. But every single time, they treated him with hostility. Bismuth continued attacking him even when he said he wasn't his mother, and even when he said no one deserves to be shattered because no one deserves to be shattered. She still went in for the attack, and he had no choice but to take her out. And then likewise, we have Jasper, who, despite the fact that she's been a consistent thorn in the crystal gem's side, Steven wanted to help her. He saw that she was corrupted and he tried to heal her, but the whole time she pretty much told him to fuck off because Jasper would rather die than accept help from Rose Quartz. And as a result, Steven just had to watch as she gradually lost herself and transformed into a literal monster. And then you have Eyeball Ruby, a person that he was technically able to save. Eyeball Ruby, well, when Steven was jettisoned into space, Eyeball Ruby was his companion. And while they continued to fight, he still helped her. When she almost got knocked off his shield and he had to pull her in, and then likewise, he saw that her gem was cracked, he still offered to help. He still tried to make friends with her. But her loyalty to Homeworld came first, and when she realized that Steven was technically Rose, she immediately went on the offense. And even when Steven tried telling her, please don't do this, she wouldn't listen. He had no choice. And we see in the episode that guilt festers. It grew. It is transformed into something ugly. And while Steven tries to pretend it's not there, he's not doing a good job of that. Especially, and which is all kind of capped off when Stevani sees the giant hallucination of Rose just scowling down at them, because in Steven's mind, if he thinks that if his mother saw him now, well, she'd be horrified, or if you want to look at it from another angle, that there is something darker to her, something that he doesn't want to face, but he have no choice. It's sad, But what makes the episode work, in my opinion, is that the episode showcases that yes, this stuff can hurt. These traumas can have an impact, but we can't just get rid of them by pretending they're not there. We need to confront them. If we don't try to confront them, they're just going to keep growing and it's going to feel worse. And if we don't do any, and ultimately it'll have an impact. If we do, and ultimately the more worse it gets, the more have an effect on us to the point where it can, we're at the point where it can make us feel things that we don't want to feel. We can be angry, we can be distant, we can be cold. But ultimately you do have to confront them. And the best part is, you don't have to confront them alone. These things may feel terrible. They may fester in your mind, and they may make you feel guilty. But the best way to deal with them is to confront them. You can't just pretend they didn't happen. You need to confront them, and and only by confronting them will you start to heal. And like I said, you don't have to do it alone. There is always people there who want to help you. As we saw with Stephen and Connie, as when they were dealing with their issues, they both were there to support one another. It's honestly nice. But it also sits with me because when this episode first came out, something happened in our family. I'm not going to say what it was specifically, but to kind of explain my part, family members want to, a family member of mine suffered a loss, and rather than be there for them, I hid. I ran away. I should have been there for them, but I didn't. I was scared. I was scared of confronting my emotions and never once thought about how they were dealing with the loss. To this day, I have regretted that decision. The family member has forgiven me, and they still treat me amicably. They still love me, and I still love them. And I have talked to them about it, and even for said loss, I did essentially write them a letter of condolence and of my own stupidity, telling them that I was a coward. To this day, I think back on that sometimes, and this episode makes me think of that because when I think of the song Here Comes the Thought, I think of them. I think of the trauma they were dealing with, of what they had, of having to deal with their loss, and how I, at the end of the day, did not do anything, did nothing to help ease that. That should have done something, but I didn't. Even if it was just a kind word, condolences. But it didn't. I was a coward. And ever since then, I have made it my mission to never run away from that again. I try to make it. I try to help define me in my everyday life. That I always try to be better. That I do not repeat the same mistakes again. And sadly, when I think of this song, I think back to that and how I continue trying to just justify my fears until eventually I couldn't run away from them. That at the end of the day, what I did was wrong. I'm never going to live it down. But I will hope every day to make it better, so that I never do that again. That even if something is painful, I have to confront it. And if someone is hurting, I want to help. Even if it's just to offer a hand of friendship or a shoulder to cry on. So yeah, so yeah. I'm sorry if I got personal. Like I said, my relationship with this episode is complicated, but objectionable. But from an objective point of view, Mindful Education is a good episode with a very good moral. Offers some very good lore and character stuff, And overall, I do think works and has plenty of heart and a very good lesson that I do think people should know. Not just kids, but everybody. So, yeah, on the whole, like I said, Buddy's book, nice little filler episode that drops little hints of this, that drops little hints of future lore. And Mindful Education, I think, is a very heartfelt story that brings to get. It's a very heartfelt story that offers some good character stuff with Stephen and Connie, offers some more interesting lore, and has a very good, unique message, and honestly, a really touching song to go along with it. So, yeah, that's about it. I apologize for getting as personal, and I'm sorry for I apologize for getting as personal as I did, but I do hope you enjoyed this video. And next week, I'm probably not going to get as personal with it, with what's going on, but next week we are going to be looking at some more stuff, and thankfully these, from what I can remember, those episodes are actually a bit more lighthearted and a bit more fun than what we got here. Which I'm not saying this episode was bad again. Just those are not going to be dealing with this heavy shit. So hopefully we can look forward to those, and those will be uploaded on Friday as the usual, as is per usual. So, like I said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you have a good Saturday. I'm Samuel Johnson, and I will hopefully see you next Friday. Take care.